Hi. Welcome to our third CGS lecture for fall 2024. My name is Per Kassel. I'm a Director of Graduate Studies at the International Institute. I'm also a historian in modern China and an affiliate of CGS in my capacity of doing Sino-Japanese history. So I'm just going to do a couple of general announcements before we go on. First, please join us next week on October 3rd. For our next lecture in the fall CGS Thursday lecture series entitled Examining and Understanding Distress Experience for Japanese Women, a retrospective given by Professor and CGS Director, who is with us today, Elise St. Arnaud. For those attendees joining the webinar, webcams and microphones have been muted, but invite you to use the Q&A function during the lecture to submit any questions you have, and our presenter will try to address as many questions as possible. The live transcription feature, closed captions, is enabled. If you would not rather have it, go to the bottom right corner and disable it. And I will moderate the discussion, so bear with me later. Please check our CGS event page or various social media pages for the more CGS events in fall 2024. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce Professor Emer O'Dwyer, who is a Director of East Asian Studies program at Oberlin College and Associate Professor. Sorry?
I just finished my term. So.
You just finished your term? Well, I'm going to finish my term as I director too, so we're looking forward to So she's an Associate Professor of History and East Asian Studies, and we also went to graduate school together and took a couple of seminars in Japanese history with Andy Gordon. Professor O'Dwyer is the author of Significant Soil, Settler Colonialism and Japan's Urban Empire in Manchuria, published by Harvard University Press in 2015. She's work published in Modern Asian Studies, the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Asian History, Roman Rosenbaum edited, Manga and the Representation of Japanese History, as well as blog posts in the Library of Congress in Global Urban History. She specializes in 20th century Japanese history with research interest in imperialism, democracy, and post-war Allied occupation. She's currently working on her boss rule in Japan from wartime era to the beginning of the high growth era of the mid-1950s. Please join me and welcome Professor O'Dwyer.
Thank you, Tar, and thank you all for coming. Thank you especially to the Center for Japanese Studies. It is a great honor to give a talk here. I'm an admirer of this center, and I'm very happy to be here in person. So thank you again for the invitation. And yes, Par and I were in graduate school 20-some years ago, so time flies. So if you I'll begin my talk now. It's entitled Democracy on the Edge, Aichi's Atsumi Peninsula, 1952. If you step off the bullet train at Toyohashi and head southwest, you reach the head of the Atsumi Peninsula, which stretches 28 miles west before ending at Cape Irago. The Pacific Ocean is to the east and Ise Bay to the west. I should also just mention that there is a handout where I have most of the terms that may not be familiar to some of you, as well as places, and it's a two-sided handout. So hopefully that will be of some help in orienting you to the places I mentioned. The Pacific Ocean is to the east and Ise Bay to the west. On the ocean side are gorgeous blue, sparkling waters and sandy beaches. On the opposite side is a tranquil bayscape that stretches across to the mirror Chita Peninsula to the north and encompasses Mikawa Bay to the east. These views, especially those from Cape Irago, have attracted the attention of lyricists for centuries. Enshrined first in the 8th century Manyoshu and later by Matsuo Basho, who reputedly visited the Cape in 1687 to visit a haiku disciple who was also a local official. For all its beauty, the Atsumi Peninsula was not fertile land, at least not until the completion of the Toyokawa Irrigation Canal in 1967. Prior to this, access to water had been a problem for centuries. The peninsula has no major river or other freshwater source. Rice paddy agriculture was inconceivable. On the other hand, The strategic value of the peninsula's western flank and its proximity to the Pacific, as well as Ise and Mikawa bays, rendered the area valuable real estate for authorities throughout the ages. In the Tokugawa period, roughly 2/3 of the land on the peninsula was held by the Tahara domain, whose castle town was located just over 10 miles west of Toyohashi. Various hatamoto held the remaining 20% or so of holdings. And the Tokugawa clan held for itself Cape Irago with its commanding view. In the late 1890s, the Imperial Japanese Army identified the peninsula's western edge as an ideal place to build a test firing range to supplement that in place at Shizuhara in Chiba Prefecture. In 1897, the Army reached an agreement with private landowners in the villages of Nakayama and Irago, as well as with the Imperial Household Agency, to appropriate land for construction of a range that would allow for artillery to be shot to a distance of up to 10,000 meters, or roughly 6 miles. Protests by local farmers and fishers were useless in the face of a Meiji army intent on expansion and flush with war reparations following victory over China 2 years earlier. By November 1901, the site was in operation. Victory over Russia in 1905 led to further expansion. And by March 1906, 114 households comprising 729 persons were relocated to make room for cannon mounts, observation bunkers, artillery warehouses, pyrotechnic storage sites, and emergency bunkers. Moved inland, the uprooted villagers faced great difficulty with farming on sandy, arid soil. In the years that followed, their new settlement became one of the poorest on the peninsula. Fishers paid heed to regular notices in local newspapers listing the times the range would be active. Fishing from the shore around Cape Irago during these times was forbidden, as was local boat traffic. This presentation focuses on a second instance, this time in the period immediately following World War II, in which Tokyo again set its sights on Irago. The plan was to resurrect the old firing range and to again relocate civilians to accommodate its needs. The historical particulars were, of course, different in 1952 than they had been at the turn of the century, this time requiring the dismantling of a farming or kaitaku site established by the Ministry of Agriculture in 1945 for those devastated at war's end by urban incendiary bombing and the collapse of empire. In 1952, the operators of the range would be the National Police Reserve, created in August 1950 under the third Yoshida Shigeru cabinet, with strong backing from John Foster Dulles and the Truman administration in Washington, to provide internal security for Japan in anticipation of the end of the Allied occupation. Thus was the desperate need for land for the displaced pressured to give way to the Yoshida administration's efforts to accommodate US requests for Japan's rearmament. Yoshida's calculus in accommodating these requests, as is well known, was to expedite an end to the occupation such that Japan could transform itself post-haste into a commercial nation. In the event, the Irago test firing range was never rebuilt. Robust protests by citizens and local officials from around the greater Ise Bay area in fall 1952 derailed the plan and led to the government's naming of the seaside village of Uchinada on the Japan Sea in Ishikawa as the designated site. The requisitioning at Uchinada would be for just 4 months, the government promised. Protests by Uchinada residents began almost immediately following the formal announcement on December 2nd, 1952. A note regarding firsts bears mentioning from the outset. Uchinada is typically billed as the first anti-base movement of the post-war. Uchinada, and equally Sunagawa, southwest of Tokyo, has become shorthand for the assertion of citizen voices against the basification, or by some measures, the colonialization, shokunichika, of post-occupation Japan. So here I make two interventions. First is to draw attention to the fact that Uchinado was not, in fact, the first anti-base movement of the post-war. Arguably, Irago was, as well, importantly, as the first to result in a complete victory for those protesting the government requisition of land. Second, the question of timing is better served in recognition of how the Irago protest might best be understood in the context of an environment of crisis politics. Such an environment characterizes the setting in which Japanese government elites, politicians, and bureaucrats operated in 1952 in the months on either side of the sovereignty divide, marked by the April 28, 1952, end of the occupation at precisely 10:30 p.m. It was in such an environment that the third and then fourth Yoshida Shigeru cabinets confronted priorities on multiple fronts concerning how best to restore social and economic security to the nation. At the same time, Yoshida's government was forced to respond to twin pressures, those from the Truman administration, as well as those from the anti-Yoshida faction within Yoshida's own Liberal Party. My account here diverges from recent accounts of anti-base politics in its focus not on Cold War geopolitics and the formation of the US-Japan alliance in the crucible of site fights regarding firing ranges or training grounds. Rather, the narrative I present concerns political dynamics at the local level. Fundamentally, it asks the question, not was rural society democratic or undemocratic during the occupation and its immediate aftermath, but rather, what were the tensions among various levels of authority in acquiescing to government policy formulated at the top? In the context of this presentation, these tensions were especially acute regarding the question of how best to allot Japan's limited acreage in the post-war years. Should it be used to house and feed those with few resources, such as the war-devastated and those repatriated from empire? Or should it be used for artillery ranges, airfields, and other sites devoted to meeting Washington's expectations of Tokyo's obligations in upholding the bilateral alliance? The account that follows relies on the writings of Sugiura Minpei, a scholar, farmer, born and raised in Fukue-cho on the bay side of the Atsumi Peninsula, who began his career as a student of Japanese literature at Tokyo Imperial University, from which he graduated in 1936. During the war years, Minpei learned Italian and became a central member of the capital's wartime bundan, writing tanka on the one hand and translating Leonardo da Vinci's letters on the other, before returning to Fukue in 1945 at age 32, a refugee from firebomb-devastated Tokyo. Minpei would remain in Fukue for the remainder of his life, another 55 years, immersing himself in farming, literature, and local politics. Between 1949 and 1962, he was a member of the Communist Party and a key member of the local Fukue Saibo, or JCP cell. By the early 1950s, Minpei had made a name for himself as a key figure in the newly popular genre of hiroku bungaku, or reportage. His first extended foray into reportage was the seaweed pole affair, or Norisoda Sodoki, which appeared in serialized form in Kindai Bungaku, modern literature, between September 1952 and April 1953, and chronicled how, since the 1930s and continuing through the occupation years, local bosses in Fukue exploited marine resources and labor for their own personal enrichment. His 1955 reportage, A Chronicle of Typhoon 13, Taifu Jusango Shimatsuki, described the destruction wreaked by the 1953 super typhoon that devastated the Atsumi Peninsula, as well as the rampant corruption of local officials charged with disaster recovery in its wake. In between these two accounts, in 1954, Minpei published Base 605, Kichi Ropyakugo, another long-form piece of reportage, which, like his other works in the genre, exposed social ills and the quest for justice by the downtrodden in early 1950s Hukue. The presentation that follows takes base 605 as its primary source and is divided into three parts, all concerning the western edge of the peninsula in the years between 1945 and 1952. The first part concerns the post-war Kaitaku program. The second describes how the incompleteness of SCAP reforms in the countryside gave rise to widespread economic precarity, a situation that heightened farmer-fishers' vulnerability to the promise of regular government subsidies in exchange for land given to the range. Finally, a concluding third section considers how Prime Minister Yoshida's political troubles within his own Liberal Party in summer and fall 1952 likely impacted the ultimate cabinet decision delivered on December 2nd, 1952, not to carry through with reconstructing the Irago base, and instead to allow the Kaitaku land to remain undisturbed. The post-war massive displacement of people is typically associated in the Japanese context with the huge flood of hikeagesha, or repatriates from the colonies that poured into the home islands after August 1945. However, it is important to remember that as early as June 1945, an estimated total of 7.7 million people had already been displaced, either in preemptive or ex post facto attempts to escape the incendiary bombing of Japan's cities. By late August 1945, almost 500,000 more had been displaced. As historian Yasuoka Kenichi reminds us, these numbers represent a far larger displacement than that of the post-August 1945 hikeagesha. As early as September 2nd, 1945, the day on which the instrument of surrender was signed on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese government officials met to set in motion a plan for setting aside 7.4 million acres nationwide for use as kaitaku or farming sites, with priority given to those either made homeless by the war or unemployed by the collapse of the military-industrial complex, or in many cases, both. Nishiyama, the area along the western edge of the Atsumi Peninsula, over which various artillery shot from the Imperial Army range had hurtled since 1901, was designated as a kaitaku site in October of 1945. It measured 5.5 miles north to south and just over a mile east to west. About 2 miles of land would be opened for farming. The northern section of this tract still bore the remnants of the imperial past, with watchtowers and guard posts scattered here and there alongside deserted barracks. Like much of the rest of the peninsula, Nishiyama was poorly suited for agriculture. What was more, it was subject to high pileups of sandy soil occasioned by the heavy winds that regularly blew eastward off of Ise Bay. Indeed, there is no mountain in Nishiyama. The yama of its name refers only to those sandy pileups. While it is not clear how knowledgeable Tokyo planners were regarding Nishiyama's unsuitability to farming, they knew for sure that the kaitakusha would need training. Thus, beginning in April 1946, did aspirants, a motley crew of 101 hikeagesha composed of those newly returned from Korea, the war displaced from Nagoya, as well as decommissioned soldiers, first received training in Okazaki near Nagoya. Only 10% of them had any farming experience. Those who had not been soldiers were former school principals, postal workers, factory hands, merchants, and metal workers. At roughly the same time, a corps of workers labored to clear Nishiyama of the low-growth pine trees that dominated its landscape, measuring out small plots to be transferred to the new kaitakusha and demolishing most of the old army facilities in Konakayama. In March 1947, Small houses of between just 20 and 30 meters with no electricity greeted the new arrivals. The early experience of the Nishiyama Kaitakusha was grueling. In base 605, Minpei inserts first-person narration from Nakano, a decommissioned soldier enlisted in the worker corps to detail the group's challenges, privations, and routine humiliations. Nakano relates how, due to the inadequate distribution of rice, families supplemented their meager rations by adding potatoes and leaves to their pots. Helping fishers on the Mikawa and Ise Bay shores pull in their nets in exchange for a small portion of their haul was another survival strategy, as was hunting snakes and frogs. Unsolicited advice issued regularly from residents of neighboring hamlets who would, according to Nakano's telling, watch as Kaitakusha labored to mix the imported soil received from Kaitaku authorities with the sand that formed the bulk of their assigned plots. Nothing will come of that, the observers would remark. Better just take off somewhere for factory work. Kaitaku children who attended school in the adjacent hamlet of Nakayama were taunted, bullied, and scorned. Challenges were, to be sure, very much a part of the Kaitakusha experience nationwide. Consider, for example, the 1,000 Nagoya urbanites moved in 1946 to Bie in central Hokkaido, where the aggravations of tilling soil unsuitable for agriculture, here the problem was heavy ash content owing to the proximity of the nearby active volcano Daisetsuzan, was compounded by voluminous amounts of snow and bears. Further south in Chiba Prefecture, about 100 newly minted Kaitakusha arrived to begin toiling their allotted plots near Sanritsuka in late January 1946, only to be violently attacked by local residents and unjustly charged by officials with illegal occupation of the land. Yet the narrative of the Nishiyama Kaitaku site that has emerged, both from Minpei's 1954 account and others written subsequently, is of the determined overcoming of obstacles and ultimate, if still moderate, success in producing food from inhospitable soil. Early success with potatoes led to harvesting of watermelon, daikon, and other vegetables. Better drainage and soil quality led by the spring of 1952 to expectations of the best harvest yet, which would now include barley and peas. Nakano's testimony reveals that farming was not yet a path to self-sufficiency. He, for example, supplemented his income with work in the Kaitaku office, helping local fishers, hauling in their dragnets, and working road construction as a day laborer. It was nonetheless, by occupation's end, arable land. Setbacks came in two forms in spring 1952. First, a forceful hailstorm laid waste to the barley and pea fields. Second, sightings of Americans with maps engaged in discussion with Kaitaku officials in the Nishiyama fields led to reports that two former lieutenant generals from the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, one of them was a ballistics specialist, had come down from Tokyo to conduct surveys and measurements. How Minpei reports all of this is very much a part of the style and content of Base 605. So first, a word on his method. Lyrical descriptions of place, vividly drawn character portraits, lively dialogue, and a disjointed narrative that stretches backwards and forwards in time are all quintessential elements of Minpei's style. The combination of extended character profiles together with blow-by-blow descriptions of the politics of the everyday underscores how characters' emotions in the tense interpersonal confrontations that provide another constant to his narratives are guided by complex cultural and economic factors. Minpei was a card-carrying JCP member, but this is no dry dialectical materialism. Rather, it is the work of a Renaissance man with an ear finely tuned to both the power of language and the contradictions and absurdities of Japan's tumultuous transition from war to occupation to dependent independence, as some have termed the last Yoshida cabinets. Base 605 features a sizable cast of characters representing stakeholders in the firing range protest, from the fisher farmers of Fukue's hamlets, the villages of Nakayama and Konakayama together accounted for about 45% of Fukue's 15,000 persons in 1952, to Nagoya's dock workers, Chamber of Commerce members, Aichi prefectural officials, and Tokyo's bureaucrats. Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru is mentioned, though only in passing. America and Americans, too, have only a shadowy presence in Base 605. Populating the story with largely unknown actors forces a fresh reckoning for the reader with the familiar story of anti-base politics expressed through citizen assemblies and petition drives to Tokyo. Certainly, the plot lines would have been recognizable to contemporary readers. Indeed, a widely read account of the Uchinada struggle by the journalists Handa Masao and Kuboto Yasutaro was published in September 1953, 8 months before Base 605 appeared in book form. But the revelation of Minpei's style is how he renders his protagonists' histories, tying together wartime past and post-war present in ways that highlight the persistent continuities at every level of the trans-war experience. Consider two characters who appear early in the narrative. And I have no photographs here because they're, on the one hand, Minpei uses pseudonyms for everyone in the local society, but of course he uses the names of elected public officials. So those I have photos of, but for the local society, there are pseudonyms and there are no pictures that I can find for that very reason, as well as for other reasons too. These were people who were not in the limelight, shall we say. So consider these two characters, Morishita Hitaro and Kiyota Kazuo. Minpei provides extended biographical information of these two men related by marriage in Fukue's closely woven society. By 1952, when the action starts, Hitaro serves as ward chief in Konakayama, an unelected position he refuses to relinquish despite efforts by his peers to oust him. In defense against his neighbors' pleas, Kitaro notes that the local autonomy law passed by the Diet in 1947 and intended to lessen Tokyo's control over local administration makes no provision stipulating that ward members could force a ward chief to quit. It was an argument only a man of considerable local influence and wealth would dare to make. Kitaro was such a man. He had, as a youth, during the pre-war years, built himself up from office tea pourer at the Irago Range to the position of labor broker responsible for hiring and managing the range's day laborers, skimming 15 sen off the top of each of the laborers, 1 yen, 20 sen daily wage. Kitaro supplemented his income by selling discarded scrap iron, as well as by the occasional bribing of misbehaving workers in exchange for his discretion. Such was his accumulated wealth by the early 1930s that he built a lavish 2-story mansion ringed by a stone wall atop a Konakayama hill. Locals dubbed it Otenshu, or the Castle Tower, suggesting not only the anachronistic look of the edifice, but equally the feudalistic disposition of its inhabitant. A managerial position at the local Mitsu branch kept Kitaro flush during the war years, as did a job at the Toyokawa Imperial Navy Arsenal, established in late 1939, where he helped manage a portion of its 50,000 workers. In the wake of defeat, Kitaro made another small fortune selling off what remained of the arsenal's provisions. During the occupation years, Kitaro maintained his connections with the staff and officers of the Imperial Army's Technology Bureau, who had supervised the original Irago firing range before returning to their lives in Tokyo after the war. Thus, it was in late spring 1952 that Kiyota Kazuo, whom I introduce next, turned to Kitaro to inquire about the rumor circulating about plans allegedly being laid in Tokyo to make the range operational again. To the extent that Base 605 has one central unifying character, it is Kiyota Kazuo, a 30-something JCP member who hailed from a Nakayama family with a holding of just under 2 acres, a land holding that placed the Kiyotas among the lower strata of mid-level landowners in the pre-war period. Kazuo went up to Tokyo for his secondary school education before entering the Imperial Japanese Army Officers Training Academy. Minpei provides no dates for this biography, but it seems that Kazuo's time at the academy was during the early 1940s. Scheduled to complete his final year of officer training in Manchukuo, Kazuo's fate twisted when the cargo boat he had boarded in Maizuru for embarkation to the continent was torpedoed, forcing him to return to the port city, where he stayed until war's end, before returning home to Nakayama and falling in with Minpei, whose Tanka Poetry Club he joined. Late 1940s Japan was the era of circles, and Kazuo and Minpei brought this creative energy to Fukue with great gusto. Movies, plays, and social dancing taught by returnees from the Soviet Union provided entertainment and cultural nourishment. For intellectual stimulation, they formed a social issues study group. When Minpei joined the Communist Party in 1949, Kazuo did too. Together, they formed a local cell for the JCP. Minpei's early and extended introduction of Kitaro and Kiyota, and I follow Minpei's method in referring to these characters, underscores the importance of 2 themes central to understanding the social, political, and economic dynamics of trans-war Fukue. The first is the incomplete nature of SCAP-ordained land reform. By Minpei's telling, land reform on the Atsumi Peninsula was a name only. The second theme is the continued hold on post-war local politics by pre-war elites. These elites, many of whom during the war occupied some level of authority at the IGA firing range, operated in the post-war as rapacious landlords, Minpei would call them bosses, demanding exorbitant fees of tenant farmers while applying relentless pressure for subsistence-level farmer fishers to sign off portions of their newly acquired holdings. It was the plight of the tenant farmers, who constituted 1/3 of Nakayama's 500 farming households in 1950, that became the focus of Kiyota's political activity following his election to the Fukue Land Commission, Nogyo Inkai, in August 1949. Initially, the Japanese Farmers Union, Nichino, had operated a local branch, which, during the first round of land reform in 1946, had reported to SCAP the illegal re-requisitioning of land by the old landlord class. However, with SCAP's order to abolish the Nichino branch as land reform progressed, violations of the rights of the new tenant farmer class had become egregious and widespread. Kiyota's aim in seeking election on the Fukue Land Commission had been motivated especially by the desire to stop the repossessing of tenant farmers' land by wealthy landowners. One of his main challenges in this work was emboldening the dispossessed to take action against the local heavyweights, whose tactics of intimidation were formidable. An incidental effect of Communist Kiyota's membership on the Land Commission was the access it provided him to prefectural authorities as government plans for the National Police Reserve firing range became common local knowledge in summer 1952. Common to these 2 extended biographies are the local bosses, whose influence over Fukue's economy and society extended largely uninterrupted over the trans-war divide. Lurking as the dark forces in the Kiyota biographical section are the landowners, who continue to oppress the post-war's newly enfranchised tenant farmers with their open disregard for the illegality of their actions. The dark forces in the Kitaro bio are the former members of the Imperial Army's Technology Bureau, now residing in Tokyo, who, with Kitaro's help, manipulate their former neighbors in Fukue with talk of the economic advantage to be gained by restoration of the range. In summer 1952, with sovereignty newly restored and the war now finally over, it is thus the straitened circumstances of the present moment, incomplete land reform, made worse by the dark forces from the past, unreformed exploitative landlords, that make Fukui's hamlets of Nakayama and Konakayama especially vulnerable to another blast from the dark past, the remilitarization of Nishiyama. So over the course of 6 months between June and late November 1952, Fukui residents, as well as villagers in Irago on the southern end of the Atsumi Peninsula, near where artillery would plop into the Pacific Ocean, mounted a spirited campaign to oppose the government's requisitioning of Nishiyama for use as a firing range. The days were packed, especially for Kiyota Kazuo, whose membership on the Fukui Land Commission enabled his participation on many of the 12+ petition drives to Tokyo, where he, together with Fukui local officials, as well as prefectural officials from both Aichi and Mie prefectures, met with ministers and bureau chiefs from the agriculture and foreign ministries, as well as from the nascent Ministry of International Trade and Industry. New tensions and busy itineraries for Kyoto emerged when, amidst continuing government negotiations in Tokyo in mid-November, it was proposed that the planned firing range shoot not from north to south, Konakayama to Irago, but the reverse, from Irago to Konakayama. Here was a new layer of intrigue, as residents of Konakayama and Nakayama suspected the Irago villagers of betrayal. At issue now was the threat to fishing. In whichever waters it was that the artillery shells landed, there the fish would grow scarce. So it was that Kyoto took it upon himself to travel to the fishing villages, ringing Mikawa Bay to the north, Hazu and Gamagori, as well as to Morizaki at the tip of the Chita Peninsula. Earlier, it had been the mobilization of the Kaitaku community that had been the focus of anti-range mobilizing in Aichi. The convening of a national Kaitakusha convention in Toyohashi on August 5th had provided an opportunity for information sharing and common cause, while also showcasing the vehement opposition to the Nishiyama requisition by Agricultural Minister Hirokawa Kozen, who traveled to Toyohashi for the rally. Thus did concerns for livelihood spread from land to sea, as well indeed to Nagoya and Itsukaichi on opposite sides of Ise Bay, which both feared disruption to their port's ability to attract commercial traffic, urgently needed for economic recovery, amidst a regimen of artillery drills. Let us pause here to recognize several distinctive features of the summer 1952 Irago-based protest. First, in distinction to a roughly contemporary protest in Tsuchiura in Ibaraki Prefecture, which opposed the construction of an airfield to accommodate the expansion of National Police Reserve facilities on the shores of Kasumigaura Lake, the protest against the Irago range gathered a wide array of activists spread over a wide geographic area. In Tsuchiura, protesters against airfield construction were limited to the Kaitakusha, not all of whom participated, and whose main motivation rested in a concern for livelihood. Neither communists nor labor unions, nor indeed members of the larger Tsuchiura community, played a role in that protest. Second, and relatedly, historian Shimizu Ryo recently described how discourse surrounding the Tsuchiura protests expressed not dedication to the cause of advancing peace, nor to principled objections against the base's role in intensifying Cold War antagonisms. By contrast, Kiyota Kazuo, when quizzed in early November by a pro-range member of the Konakayama Town Council regarding how an anti-rearmament stance could possibly prevent the precarious Japanese economy from collapse, responded by chiding his interrogator for falling prey to American rhetoric. The most sure path to the Japanese economy's recovery, Kyoto asserted, was the opening of Japanese-Chinese trade relations, if only the US would allow it. Third and finally, base protests in the context of the early 1950s Yobitai Keiki a phrase used by contemporaries to describe the economic boost to communities willing to host training grounds, defense schools, and other NPR facilities, should be considered with attention to the issue of Liberal Party support. In the case of Tsuchiura, the Liberal Party was resolute in its support of the NPR's repurposing of IGA infrastructure after 1950. It was considered a natural solution to provide jobs and securities to a town of 11,500 persons that had been a major Air Force town since 1920. Ultimately, the difference between Tsuchiura and Irago protests is down to results. Negotiations with national and Ibaraki prefectural authorities stretched over 3 years and resulted in the requisitioning of 34.26 hectares of the Tsuchiura Kaitaku, or just 14% of the originally proposed area. Construction of that airfield began in November 1955. In Irago, the citizen protest was a full victory and much shorter. On November 25th, 1952, the fourth Yoshida cabinet made its internal decision to pass over Irago and build a firing range at Uchinada instead. As noted earlier, on December 2nd, that decision was made public. In closing, let us consider the ways in which the Irago protest revealed the fissures in the Liberal Party in 1952 on either side of the resumption of sovereignty. 1952 was not a good year for Yoshida in multiple respects. CIA documents declassified in 2005 and publicized in 2016 reveal a plot by former IGA officers in 1952 who were intent on a rapid remilitarization of Japan to assassinate Yoshida that summer and overthrow his government. Assassination attempts aside, Yoshida faced much criticism from the public and politicians alike following Diet passage on July 4th of the Subversive Activities Prevention Law. This criticism came not only, of course, from the socialist and communist parties at whom the law was directed, but also from members of the conservative political parties, including Yoshida's own Liberal Party. Widespread dissatisfaction with what was considered Yoshida's kowtowing to Washington further eroded support from within his party, leading by August 28th, 1952, 4 months to the day since the resumption of sovereignty, to Yoshida's sudden dissolution of the Diet in response to what he deemed Liberal Party contributions to a, quote, raucous and impossible atmosphere that impeded parliamentary function. Certainly, there was open discussion among members of Yoshida's cabinet over the Irago problem throughout 1952. Take, for example, the opposing views held by Agricultural Minister Hirokawa Kozen and Minister of National Affairs Ohashi Takeo. Ohashi, who in 1951 had helped draft the bill that became the Subversive Activities Prevention Law, and who was counted among the so-called Yoshida 13, those most stalwart of proteges, which included later prime ministers such as Tanaka Kakue, Sato Eisaku, and Ikeda Hayato. Ohashi was minister in charge of the National Police Reserve. In early spring 1952, according to Minpei's account, Ohashi thundered curses at the Nakayama delegation, which had secured an audience with him in Tokyo, during which they read aloud an anti-requisition petition submitted by the Nishiyama Kaitakusha. Agriculture Minister Hirokawa is also depicted by Minpei as subject to crude and violent expressions of temper, yet he stands strongly against Yoshida's prioritization of rearmament over Kaitaku. Opposition to Yoshida's plans for the Irago range spread beyond select offices at Liberal Party headquarters in Tokyo to include party members in the Aichi Prefectural Assembly, whose frustration over Tokyo's disregard for the Assembly's unanimous resolution in mid-November opposing the requisition led one Assembly member to threaten, if the Irago plan wins cabinet approval, every last Liberal Party member in Aichi will leave the party. Likely, if the Irago protest had remained limited to a cluster of small villages and a handful of communists on the far edge of a distant peninsula, the government's plans for resurrecting the Irago range would have been realized. However, notwithstanding Atsumi's status as an impregnable fortress of Liberal Party electoral control during the first post-war years, The fractiousness of Yoshida's party in 1952 meant that the prime minister could not willy-nilly alienate party members by forcing through a plan that had supermajority popular support across the heavily populated Ise Bay region. By late autumn 1952, political capital was for Yoshida in very short supply. To give an example of the full extent of common cause and transcendence of party affiliation in opposition to the Irago scheme, Mimpei gives a fantastic piece of dialogue to his arch rival, local boss, and this is a pseudonym, Kawaguchi Kamanosuke. The 60-something Kama, as he was widely known, was a hulking presence who served as head of the Konakayama Fishing Cooperative and whose involvement in underhanded dealings had landed him in prison at least once for black market activities. A member of the Konakayama Ward Council, Kama is the anti-hero of Mimpei's The Seaweed Pole affair and is the source of frequent taunts directed at Mimpei and other members of the Fukue JCP cell. Thus, it is a true rhetorical tour de force when Mimpei records Kama as uttering at a November 12th citizen rally in the heady final stages of the Irago protest, "Today, at least, the communists are telling the truth." And today, in 2024, the western edge of the Atsumi Peninsula, amidst lush fields of cabbage, are the lingering remnants and memories of the imperial past, as well as the fight against pressured remilitarization. The watchtower still eerily stands as witness and as warning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emer. We are now open for questions, and the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to alternate between the Zoom room and the Deep Space room. So why don't we start with the room here? If anyone have any questions, and those of you who are in the audience here, please speak up a little bit so for the benefit of viewers on Zoom. So any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so not necessarily, I guess, related to content of your lecture, but I was just wondering what started your interest in this very specific area of Japan?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I have been, I just want to go back to the photographs of him because I think he's so charming. Sugihiro Mimpei just caught my attention a couple of years ago back when his piece, the chronicle of the super typhoon that hit Atsumi, it was reissued as a paperback in Tokyo on its whatever it was 70th anniversary in that year. And so they reissued it as a sort of fine piece of post-war writing that deserved a sort of second audience, that deserved a new look at that time in around 2016. And I read it, and it became for me a sort of real crystallization of just what I wanted to find in thinking about how I was going to work on occupation era history. Occupation era history has certainly at that moment in 2016 still arguably been something that was very much conducted from looking at Tokyo, from looking at SCAP, from this sort of very kind of single lens. I mean, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but what I wanted to do was to find somewhere in the countryside to kind of see where, or multiple places in the countryside, where SCAP reforms, were they taking hold, were they sticking, or were they being completely ignored, or something in between. And so Mimpei, then, as I began to discover the other things that he had written, struck me as someone who, I mean, what's extraordinary about him is he goes back to this peninsula in 1945 and he stays there for 55 years. And he writes plenty, and his writing is delightful to read, I'll say that. But he's very chatty about things that are both very personal to him, but also related to these incidents. And he says at one point, why am I staying here in this agricultural backwater, and when I could be living this nice writerly life in Tokyo? It could be so much more comfortable for me. I wouldn't be taunted by Kamanosuke all the time and all of these things. But he then reminds himself, no, I have to be a burr under the saddle of the bosses. right? If I'm not here, who's going to be the one to keep exposing all of their iniquities? But it was because also he takes his three famous pieces of writing, he's famous for, all take different, look at the same area, taking different approaches to social problems in the same communities. So the one about the seaweed affair is a fascinating look at how, without getting into seaweed reproduction, which is very complex and at the very boundary of my ability to describe, I want to say, at least without notes. He looks at how the life cycle of seaweed gets exploited by these local bosses based on some of the bosses having the beginning of the nori life cycle down here, and then other parts of Ise Bay are better for this other life cycle, and then they're moved back. And so we see both a combination of sort of knowledge or sort of proto-scientific knowledge about how seaweed reproduces, transposed onto a way for local bosses to make money and exploit local seaweed fishers. So there's a sort of environmental aspect that I thought was very interesting. It's the right time period in terms of looking, as I wanted to, at these first years after the end of the war, when the economy is devastated, when there are all these new reforms being cast, and just trying to see how that played out at the local level. Cognizant of the fact, and of course, and I've been proven right in this suspicion that it's very different depending on where you are in Japan, right? So that's why I included discussions, for example, about Tsuchiura, that other base protest. That has a whole different sort of local particularities that make it comparable but interesting. So his short answer is that I find Minpei's writings to be very lively and interesting. They read like novels, and that to me was really interesting. Again, this sort of, and also his person, the fact that he also translated letters by Michelangelo da Vinci. He publishes in all these Italian Renaissance journals, and he writes, all these kind of very local Japanese domestic politics related stories. So he, to me, was sort of a source of inexhaustible interest. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it to the Zoom room and have a question from Alison Alexei. She says, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I knew almost none of this and learned a lot today from your work. Would you be willing to connect this to more contemporary debates and protests about remilitarization? I'm writing now about Abe's early 2000s push to revise Article 9. So that jumped out at me. I understand that you're an historian, but I'm wondering how this history might impact more recently or not.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alison. So nice to hear your voice through PAR. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the presentist angle here is unmistakable. And I think you heard it loudest in my last sentence there of the presentation. So those parallels are there, and I'm sure you're aware of very many of them. But before, whether or not I choose to mention one or two now, what I would like to certainly mention is in Tokyo, when I was in Tokyo this summer, I was struck by a huge number of new books focusing on these military cities, gunto, right, during the war, and sort of how they're transitioning after the war and the occupation in this so-called yobitai keiki, right, this economy that is sort of the post-war economy trying to find its bearing in some way, and knowing that having a military base there is a sure source of income. But these multiple studies that one is the author I mentioned in the talk, Shimizu Ryo, came out with a book in May 2023, just last year, focused on Tsuchiura and how he traces the history of it as a sort of site for an air base from 1920 through the war years. It was a huge operation. And then how immediately after the post-war, the authorities in Tsuchiura decide we need to keep this going, right? So when they hear in 1950 that there's going to be National Police Reserve, the guy gets on the train the next day to go to Tokyo to say, sign us up, right? Please select this site. So his book is entirely about Tsuchiura, but there were others that were focusing on Sasebo, Maizuru, where else? Those two, certainly. But in other words, not one book, not two, but at least 3 or 4 that were all thinking about the bases, right? And the base protest, but not so much the idea of the base protests, which was a different era's historiography, right? The protests at Sunagawa, the protests at Uchinada. But now it just seemed to me that there's a very different kind of inflection of the studies of these bases, that it's not such a sort of black and white, this idea of Japan being sort of being colonized by the threat of US bases, but also by the reality of National Police Reserve, which then changes its name later to the Self-Defense Forces, those bases. And so, again, as I say, it struck me this sort of tenor of these books seemed to be quite different. And I was curious, I don't think it's a big stretch to say that it seemed this was very much in light of the kind of current events, Allison, that you're describing, in terms of there being this new push toward the rebuilding, sort of really ramping up Japan's defense budget and all that that entails. So I hope that's the beginnings of but I look forward to discussing some more.
Thank you. Any more questions? Micah?
Do we have time?
We have time. We have plenty of time. So just like relax and feel free. So first Micah and then you're the back. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I was interested in the reportage angle. As somebody whose knowledge of 20th century Japanese reportage is old and all in translation, when I hear about reportage, I think about 20s and 30s classics like Kaniko-sen or Ikiteru Heitai. I only know them from translation. Can you link Sugiura Minpei's reportage with its predecessors? Is it more connected to those predecessors, or is it more something new?
Great question. Thank you, Micah, for that. I think it's both. Histories and Professor Tobakoji at Waseda has written much about this, but the sort of linkages between earlier antecedents of post-war Kiroku Bungaku, there are sort of lineages there that are there for the argument. However, I do think that what Sugiura and others were trying to do in the immediate post-war period was quite different. So, for example, the post-war novelist Hotta Yoshie called Kiroku Bungaku the literature of war and revolution, right? That he says this in the early 1950s, which I think we can interpret that comment in a variety of ways. And if we know Hotta's work about thinking about how imperialism has left its scars on contemporary Tokyo in particular, that takes on one kind of valence, but might also be interpreted in a different way. I think Minpei was actually, I'm trying to remember exactly the lineage. He was approached, and I forget which journal, it might have been Kindai Bungaku, to be one of the people who sort of started getting this going. One of the editors that he had worked in during the pre-war years. He worked in publishing in Tokyo while by night studying Italian. And trying all he could to not have to work for a war. He worked very briefly for a Japanese government office that actually sent him to Manchuria and to China. And he came back and quit and just, didn't want any part of that. So he sort of scraped together editing jobs here and there in the wartime publishing industry in Tokyo. And one of those publishers approached him in the post-war, suggesting that he had read something else that Minpei had written. What it was he had read some of Minpei's Italian discourses on these sort of satirical Italian authors from the Renaissance period and said, wouldn't it be so interesting if you kind of took that same kind of angle, exposing corruption and graft in this kind of satiric way, and did that now? I don't know that he initiated the opinion, but from that exchange, this idea came about. So I think Minpei was not the only one doing the reportage in the immediate post-war for sure, but his work, I think, it sold very, very well. And in a way, it's surprising because he made a name for himself. His chronicling of the 1953 typhoon was made into a movie. This one, the Base 605, it got as far as a screenplay being written about this. And the only place where I can find the screenplay is in a Chinese translation of it, which is interesting in its own case. But it ultimately did not become a movie. But he had widespread appeal. And it's that, in answering to the previous question too, it's kind of that contradiction that I find so interesting. certainly when we think about how communism was considered, I mean, communism was very prevalent among the post-war literary circles, but his profile is so multifaceted that I think it makes it more interesting. At any rate, he had a lot of popularity. People knew his work, people were reading, and he was sort of, expanding interest, enlarging interest in this genre. So the other thing I would mention, and I'm forgetting the author, but there was another piece of reportage that was around the same time, which translated something like records of like a really weird, strange village or something. And I can't think of the title, but it is another case in which a writer went into this very small little community, which was not his natal community though, and just described the sort of textures of life in this countryside space. So I think that too was another focus of it. So in those ways, anyway, I'm happy to discuss more when the details are fresher in my mind.
So before, is it called Kiroku Bungaku, the
Yeah.
reportage literature?
It's written in katakana as reportage and also
Reportage.
Kiroku Bungaku.
Okay, I'm gonna ask, I might ask a question about continue that line of thought. So before I let in the next question, there's a shout out from the Zoom room from Anne Sharif saying, wonderful talk, thank you so much. So there was on the second row from the back, please.
Hi, sorry I came in late, so I'm not sure whether you mentioned this earlier at the beginning of your talk, but when I came in and you're talking about repatriation, and yeah, things like this, there is I've only read works about like repatriation from Japan, especially science, like Korean people, that's his book. So I was wondering, really like people coming into Japan and those going out, so really all the Japanese people, and how important it is as a context. And I guess I just I'm not sure whether those Japanese people were like being sent back from Korea, for example, to their like originally place, or like they were arranged to do like this from this work.
So the point I made, maybe perhaps before you came in, was that usually when we think of repatriates, hikiagesha in Japanese, it's the people who come back from the empire, from Korea, from Manchuria, from Taiwan, from the South Seas, various places that the Japanese had gone to emigrate during the wartime years, as early as 1895 in the case of Taiwan, as late as the early 1940s in some of the cases in the South Seas. But so all of those people are coming back to Japan after 1945, and it's sort of wave that lasts from, it takes a while to get the coordination of that going, the logistics, but really in earnest in 1940, late 45, 46, beginnings of 47. That's when we think of the displaced, the war displaced, that is often considered in the literature, certainly in the Anglophone literature. But I mentioned a historian who is trying to direct our attention, Yasuoka Kenichi, to the idea that that displacement within Japan was very considerable at this time too, that cities were being destroyed, people were being left homeless after the Tokyo firebombing in March 1945, for example. And so moving those people to places too. Actually, what this historian Yasuoka has shown is that was the priority for the Tokyo government in fall of 1945. They wanted to take care of them first, as well as decommissioned officers. And it was the people coming back from the colonies that was a sort of second concern. The other interesting relation to the colonies is that the people who the Japanese government enlisted in fall of 1945 to help with these internally displaced peoples were people who had experience in the empire. So people who had worked for the Korea Development Company, Kotaku, as well as for Mantaku, the Manchurian Kaitaku organization. So they wanted to sort of harness that experience of these groups that were in the empire, creating Kaitaku in the empire in the 1930s and 40s, for them then to come back to Japan and do the same work, but now for people in Japan itself. So I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but I suppose what I would say is that we need to enlarge the idea of what it means, of who the displaced were, and this is following Yasuoka, who the displaced were immediately after the defeat. It was not just people coming back from the empire; it was lots of people from within. And to me, I think what's so interesting too is how that all gets decided. So I made reference to the fact that, and there were, in Aichi Prefecture alone, there were 33 kaitaku sites. So it wasn't just this one here on the edge of the peninsula. They were scattered here and there. And they were scattered throughout the country. But the sort of poignancy of the idea that people from Nagoya, or that helped them from Okinawa, being moved to Hokkaido to try to till land on the side of a volcano. I mean, these were, in many cases, it seems not particularly well considered plans from a variety of perspectives. And so I think if we zoom way out, you know, the thing to think about is also how all of this helps us think about the nature of the immediate post-war Japanese state, how it is making these momentous decisions of tremendous scale. And how, in, you know, one thing to quickly say is, you know, how much they're using the legacy of the empire to inform these decisions in the immediate post-war, but also how they're kind of in over their heads in a lot of ways. But yeah, so the poignancy being that, yeah, if you had to move to this totally other part of the country and then be grouped in with these other people who you didn't know, you had to work in this very closely collaborative kind of extremely strenuous work. That opens up a whole new way of thinking about other possibilities for social history. The difficulty is the records, right? How to sort of get at these kind of things. And so, as I mentioned, to my chagrin, I don't have pictures or pieces. Oh yeah, I don't even have pictures of the kaitaku in Nishiyama, despite, you know, going through all local kinds of, there are a few, but none of the Nishiyama one. So there are ones of other places in Aichi. So I think this is, you know, there are lots of opportunities for research trajectories. I hope that will other people will take up as well.
It's really interesting.
You're very welcome.
Still have time for questions. I should ask a question.
Please.
And then, you know, I was very fascinated with the repertoire literature because I wrote a piece about sinology in Scandinavia, and I thought this was kind of the local genre of Jan Lidahl building a port from a Chinese village in 1963. You know, it's very much this kind of revolutionary pilgrimage from Europe to China. So is this just coincidental, or is this, are you aware of kind of connections to other types of left-wing writing in, you know, this time period? You know, just to correct me.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, yeah. The Swedish connection, I don't
think there's a Swedish connection because repertoire is not a Swedish word. It's a French word.
Yeah, no, it is right. No, I'm just saying I have no details on the Swedish aspect. Yeah. But yes, no, I mean, I think that certainly, almost certainly, yes, that, you know, even if we're just making a hypothesis based on how socialist writers were writing in the pre-war period, based on what they were reading from socialist movements in Europe. But I'm not aware of an absolute direct link other than to simply say, and I thank you for the opportunity to bring this point up, Ninpei was the most voracious reader. I mean, in a way, even knowing that, I expect in some ways speaks to his own braggadocio about that very fact. Like, he loved to talk about how well read he was. But I saw proof of it because his entire library was moved to the, let's see if I have a, where is that map I keep using? Yeah, so it's sort of here in, sorry, people on Zoom, I'm trying to point to the center of the peninsula, somewhere there around where it says Kakujoro. A little set closer to the center of the peninsula there is the Tahara municipal, like, library and stuff. Tahara refers to this whole area actually, but the municipal library and archive are there, and within just the local library located there, Ninpei's family donated all of his library after he passed away in 2001. So they sort of built a special edition with, it's a huge library, but it's there, it's his books, and you can, and nobody else is looking at them. And I went through and I just made notes of the variety of things that he's written about. But even that act on my part was not necessary because he's written a book called Hon Soshite Hon, right? Like, just keep reading, right? But then the answer to your question, Par, to get back to that, yeah, I mean, Catholic range of interests, certainly well beyond just socialist literature. But that being said, his mastery of what other European so 1949 to 61 were 61, 62 were the years that he was in the party. And that's just before he starts writing reportage.
So I have two more questions. We'll see how much we can squeeze those in and interest of time. But I think you were first, and then I have one on Zoom. So please.
Thanks so much for the talk. It was really, really interesting. And the question I had is you mentioned like the US bases and the ones in like Sasebo and like Ise Bay and stuff like that. But and I really appreciate how you focus on the local level and like on local coalition building in this case specifically. But do you see a big difference between protests or like opposition to US bases versus Jieitai or Yobitai bases? Or is it, would you say it's more a similar thing, but with maybe a little more corporate context sprinkled on? Or what?
The contemporary you're talking about?
Well, in the period and.
Are you Michael?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I meant to say I before.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, so, it's interesting because this is an answer to your question, maybe a little bit roundabout first, but Yoshida Shigeru did not like to call a spade when it came to rearmament. And so John Dower's study, Empire and Aftermath, is a fantastic biography of Yoshida from his pre-war years as in the Japanese foreign ministry, through to his serving as prime minister and foreign minister, double portfolio for 6 of the 7 occupation years. It's a masterful biography. But in that, he does talk at great length about how Yoshida never, all the while that the US is pressuring him to create this national police force, he just keeps trying to hold off on doing it. And then he tries to limit how big it is. He sets it at 75, it's set at 75,000 when it's established, but it's always, and Dower enjoys writing with his usual eloquence and wry humor about how, tanks are not called tanks, they're called special vehicles. And so how it's sort of masking the whole idea of that this is in fact a sort of an army of sorts. Related to that, though, is the idea that Minpei, when he's writing about this, he's talking all the while about the National Police Reserve, that all the rumors that are circulating are about the fact that there is going to be this Yobitai Keisatsu, right? Sort of special police reserve. But there are also hints and suggestions, because again, as I said, it's lots of dialogue. It's like a novel, right, that he puts all in there. And you'll have sort of people at the kind of citizen rally saying, well, but then are they going to turn it into an American base? Like, is it going to turn into an American base? But it's very much sort of on the side and nothing is clear. The nature of rumor, you could say, but also the fact that there doesn't seem to be any clear, they're pretty sure it's just going to be a National Police Reserve base. On the other hand, given that Yoshida won't call a spade, maybe that's not quite true. Near the end of the protests, as I said, they span from June to November of 1952. By November 1952, Minpei is talking about how occasionally in parts of Fukue, they have sort of areas that like pumpan girls and, the idea of women servicing American GIs. Some American GIs travel to go to them, but by November 1952, that business has dropped off. The Americans don't want to be there because they're sensing real kind of anti-American sentiment in Nakayama and in Fukue. But my sense, Minpei does not, as I said at one point in the talk, Yoshida has a sort of shadow, is like barely mentioned in it, right, by name. And the Americans have a really sort of shadowy presence. It's not his focus, really, which I think is also interesting because when I set it up, when I first started reading it, I expected something entirely different. In a way, he's almost saying, that's not really the issue here. The issue is the Japanese government. So it's not that, yes, it's true that Kyoto says at that time when someone says, well, how is the Japanese economy going to recover if we don't have a rearmaments economy? And Kazuo says, well, you're just falling for American rhetoric here. But there isn't a lot of whatever anti-American is, it's mentioned as sort of heard in passing from people at a rally, or it's sort of a one-off. But the true focus, and for me, what is interesting in response to the earlier question, I approached this, I was attracted to Minpei's writing because America was so decentralized. So he doesn't make those connections as like, if you want to see very outright connections against US bases, then the Uchinada protest gives you a lot of that, which comes right after. And what's also interesting in that case is they seem to take a very different tack. The requisitioning of this was never said to be just going to be a brief moment, but in Uchinada, they say, we're just going to take it for 4 months. And then they extend it indefinitely the following year. And it becomes not just National Police Reserve, but also American troops, which could have happened here too, but certainly the talk on the ground is that it's just National Police Reserve.
Thank you. So, final question from the Zoom room is Michael I. It says, thank you for the call. I was wondering when Winter wrote about the struggle between the local bosses and this protest. Please be right about the local religious institutions and priests.
No, there is no religion in this.
Oh.
Yeah, it's
That's
really
surprising.
quite striking. It is quite striking. There's none. I can't think of a single instance. Not a single one. Which is not to say that they weren't there, but he does not mention them. Yeah.
So I think we are, for any questions. Are we ready to sound the email off with a part proposal?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you all for the insightful questions. I'll take them all to heart.